The Chief Economic Advisor, the CEA, Subramanian, has stepped down. KV Subramanian decides to step down, but also clarifying that this is a stepping down at the end and expiry of the 3-year term. He steps down as the Chief Economic Advisor and he says, I have decided to return to academia. Returning to academia is the reason that has been given by the CEA, and this is of course after he has already completed his tenure for 3 years. Let's get in further inputs. We have with us Times Network's correspondent Hina Gambhir, who's getting us further details here on this. Hina, while this is being seen as a stepping down, but it's also happening after the term ends here, what more do we have on this development?
Well, his term was supposed to get over in December this year, and just a few months before that, the Chief Economic Advisor has decided to step down, and the reason that's being given right now is that he wants to return back to academia, and that's the reason why this kind of a decision has been taken. Of course, he has thanked the current dispensation, and this reminds us of how, Mr. Raghuram Rajan also in the past had decided to step down. In fact, many such officials, who were on board decided to step down suddenly. So definitely it raises questions. There are several instances that we can talk about. But then as far as Mr. Subramanian is concerned, there was no specific reason that we can say was, there. And it looks like it was his personal decision because of some personal issues. He decided to step down right now because things were pretty smooth between him and the government. There were no, disagreements as well as you can say between him and the government over policy issues. In fact, he has advised the government on a number of issues. So we'll see how the government really responds to this, because in the statement as well that he has released, his office has released, he mentions that, he received tremendous encouragement and support from within the government. And he says that, he's been fortunate to enjoy a warm relationship with senior functionaries. So it looks as if he probably wanted to step down because of, personal or reasons that he has now for his future. And that's the reason why now this decision has been taken.
All right. Well, many thanks, Hina, for getting us those details. But also, as you point out, it's close to the end and expiry of the 3-year term. It isn't exactly the end. It's still 2 months short. That 3-year term ends in the month of December. So he's literally stepped down 2 months before the end of that expiry. What more should be read into this here? We're connected with economist Mr. Santosh Mehrotra as well. Good evening, sir. Thank you for being with us here. While this has been cited as a reason on wanting to pursue academia, it's also falling short of completing 2 months of that 3-year term.
It is falling short, but you have to appreciate that this is precisely the time that the economic survey of the Ministry of Finance of the Government of India for the financial year 2021-22 would be under preparation, and that has to be released the day before the budget. The budget is announced on the 1st of February, and if he was to actually leave in December, there would be absolutely no time for the next person to lead the work on the economic survey. So, I mean, if he was leaving, I suspect this is a mutual agreement between the finance minister and the CEA that he leaves in sooner rather than later. Now, of course, he could very well have been extended because he's been a very devoted advocate of the government, regardless of whether the government's policies could be defended or not.
Right.
He's tried his best to defend them. So his leaving obviously comes as a surprise. He is the second chief economic advisor to leave. Earlier, Dr. Arvind Subramanian had left. Now this gentleman has left. Honestly, if you ask me, under this government, no chief economic advisor has had much say in any policy formulation. They are supposed to play a certain role, and that's what this person was playing in this government. After all, the reason why he was appointed is the following. He's a finance economist. He came from the Indian School of Business. He's not a fit person to be chief economic advisor. And please understand that he was appointed because he wrote a great um, encomium of the demonetization, and what a wonderful thing for the economy that was. And lo and behold, he got appointed. The fact of the matter is that demonetization was had a terrible
Right.
impact on the economy and loss of jobs, and that was the beginning of the slowdown
But Mr.
in our
Mehrotra,
economy.
that would mean that there were no such differences. Yes, there were no such differences with the government. He's someone who saw through the pandemic as well, in newer policies that were announced through the pandemic, in changes that were made as well. This stepping down 2 months before the end of the term doesn't necessarily then mean any differences.
It may well be that what you're saying is correct, but we will wait to see as to what in fact is the real reason, which will also obviously emerge sooner or later. But the bottom line, I think, what your viewers need to understand is that this is not a government which necessarily listens to economists. And if it was listening to economists for the last 3 years, I think the economy would not be in such dire straits even before the pandemic. And the way the pandemic's economic impact was handled was itself quite shabby, because our contraction was the worst among all G20 countries. Why was the contraction the worst? Because all the economists outside of government were recommending that the fiscal deficit should be increased and fiscal stimulus should be much more than the 2.2% of GDP that was put in place by this government. And this government still didn't do it when the whole world was turning Keynesian. All of North America, all of Europe, as well as the emerging market economies were putting in fiscal stimulus of 4.7% of GDP or more. The Indian government puts in place a fiscal stimulus of 2.2% of GDP. So honestly, bottom line is Chief Economic Advisor was
Okay.
irrelevant,
All right.
and his leaving makes precious little difference to this government.
Well, Mr. Mehrotra, appreciate you sharing your views here. There's a fair amount of speculation here to this as well. Despite clarification, of course, that has come in officially, stepping down for academic pursuit here, but it's also stepping down, barely falling 2 months short of completing that 3-year term. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that, Mr. Mehrotra. Many thanks for sharing your view.